She walked into that cafe soaking wet, shaking, and completely alone. 78 years old, one sentence on her lips, and every single person in that room looked right through her, except him. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't a hero. He was a mechanic sitting in the corner of a dying mountain town, drinking bad coffee and trying to forget a war nobody thanked him for fighting. But the moment he saw her eyes, the way they kept cutting toward the door like something was still chasing her, he set down his cup, because he'd seen that look before. Not in a cafe, in a combat zone. If this story already has you holding your breath, you're exactly where we want you. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell, because every week we bring you stories that will stop you cold. Stories about ordinary people caught in extraordinary moments, where one decision changes everything. Drop a comment below and tell us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story has traveled across the world. And don't forget to like this video. It costs you nothing, but it means everything to us. Now, stay with me. Because what this woman whispered next, nobody in that cafe was ready to hear. The rain had been falling on Silver Creek for 6 hours straight, not the kind of rain that smells like pine and clean mountain air. This was the other kind. Cold, relentless, the kind that turns dirt roads to mud and makes a person feel like the sky itself has given up. It hammered the roof of Loretta's roadside cafe in uneven rhythms, and the neon sign outside buzzed and flickered against the dark, like it was arguing with itself about whether to stay on. Inside, the place was half empty and tired. A trucker in a yellow rain slicker sat at the far end of the counter nursing something hot. 2 teenagers shared a booth and didn't speak to each other, both staring at phones. Loretta herself, a heavy-set woman in her 50s who'd inherited the cafe from her mother and the exhaustion from life in general, leaned against the back counter refilling sugar dispensers with the focus of someone who had learned to find peace in small tasks. Nobody was paying attention to the door, which is why nobody noticed when it opened. She came in slow. That was the first thing. Not like someone escaping the rain. You rush when you're escaping the rain. You shoulder through the door and shake yourself off and exhale with relief. She came in the way people move when they're not sure the place they're entering is safe. One hand still on the doorframe, eyes sweeping the room before her body committed to crossing the threshold. She was old, 70-something, maybe pushing 80, wearing a gray wool coat that was soaked through at the shoulders and a pair of brown shoes that had not been made for weather like this. Her white hair was plastered to her forehead. Her hands, when she finally let go of the door, were trembling, not from the cold. Ethan Caldwell saw all of this in the time it takes most people to glance up and look back down. He was sitting alone in the corner booth farthest from the door. Habit, not preference. Back to the wall, sightline to the entrance, nearest exit noted. He'd done it so long, it wasn't even a conscious choice anymore, the way veterans sometimes wake up and find themselves counting exits before they've had their first thought of the day. His coffee was half-finished and lukewarm. He hadn't touched it in several minutes. He'd been watching the rain and not thinking about anything in particular, which, at 39, was its own kind of accomplishment. Atlas lay on the floor beside him, chin on his front paws, amber eyes half closed. The dog was 11 years old, which in German Shepherd years meant he'd earned his rest, but his ears hadn't dropped. They were still up, rotating slowly like radar dishes. He'd been like that since the woman walked in. Ethan watched her stand near the entrance for a moment, scanning, hesitating, recalibrating, and he cataloged what he saw without labeling it yet. Coat too thin for the altitude, shoes worn at the heels, long walk or poor circulation, hands shaking but posture controlled. She was trying to hide the shake, which meant she was aware of it, which meant the fear was deliberate and not panic. Her eyes moved in a specific pattern: entrance, back exit, windows, faces. Not the darting look of someone confused, the methodical sweep of someone making sure she hadn't been followed. He'd seen that pattern in one other context in his life, and it wasn't a cafe. She approached the counter. Loretta looked up from the sugar dispensers and offered the automatic smile of a woman who'd spent 30 years making strangers feel welcome. "What can I get you, honey?" The old woman's voice was quiet, carefully quiet, the kind of quiet that takes effort. "I'm sorry to bother you. Could you tell me where the nearest police station is? Loretta blinked. Police? Is everything— I'm fine, the woman said. I just need the address. The trucker at the counter glanced over his shoulder, then back at his coffee. The teenagers didn't look up. Loretta hesitated for half a second, then pulled out her phone to check the address. And in that half second, the old woman's eyes moved again. Entrance, windows, entrance. And Ethan saw her hands grip the edge of the counter. He stood up. Atlas lifted his head. Ethan crossed the cafe quietly, the kind of movement that doesn't announce itself, and he came to stand a few feet from the woman. Not behind her, not directly beside her, but offset, so she could see him clearly and not feel boxed in. He'd learned that too, in places far less comfortable than this. Ma'am? She turned. When she looked at him, the careful composure on her face flickered, just for a fraction of a second, the way it does when someone who has been holding themselves together for a very long time suddenly stands in front of another human being who is actually paying attention. I'm Ethan, he said. I just want to make sure you're all right. She studied him the way people study strangers when they're deciding how much to trust. She took in the worn jacket, the rough hands, the dog that had now risen and was standing calmly at Ethan's left side. She took in his face. Not unkind, not pushy, just present, waiting. I'm fine, she said again. Okay, he said, and he didn't push. He just stayed. Atlas made a sound, not a bark, not even a whine, just a low exhale through his nose, like a sigh. The woman looked down at the dog, and something shifted in her expression. She looked back up at Ethan. My granddaughter, she said, very quietly, is still inside that house. The cafe noise, rain, coffee machine, muffled country song from a radio in the kitchen, all of it continued. But Ethan felt the air in the room change, the way air changes in the seconds before a situation becomes something you can't walk back from. He kept his voice level. What's her name? Olivia. How old is she? 35. He nodded once. And she can't leave? The woman closed her eyes for just a moment, and when she opened them, the careful control cracked a little more. She won't leave. She keeps saying she's fine. She's not fine. She hasn't been fine in 2 years. Sit down, Ethan said, and his tone wasn't a command. It was just quiet certainty, the kind that makes people feel like sitting down is actually possible. Please, let me get you something warm. Matt. Her name was Clara Bennett, and she told him everything over a cup of tea she barely touched. Olivia had met Victor Hale 26 months ago at a friend's wedding in Missoula. Clara had liked him at first, tall, articulate, attentive in the way that looks like love, until you understand it isn't. He had money, or the appearance of it. He had presence. He asked about Clara, remembered her birthday, brought flowers the first time he came to dinner. He was exactly the kind of man you want for your granddaughter, Clara said. That's the hardest part to explain to people. He was exactly that. The changes came slowly. Olivia stopped answering calls as quickly. Then she started apologizing for things that weren't her fault. Victor had a difficult week. We can't make it to Sunday dinner. I hope you understand. Then the Sunday dinners stopped altogether. Then the texts got shorter. Then there were weeks of silence, followed by a photo on her phone's location feature showing Olivia at the farmhouse outside Silver Creek, where Victor had moved them 6 months after they started seeing each other. Clara had driven out once to visit. Victor had been charming at the door. Olivia had been perfectly pleasant, perfectly put together, and had said nothing real for 2 hours. When Clara left, she'd turned back to wave from the driveway and seen Olivia standing in the window, watching her go. And the expression on Olivia's face before she realized Clara was looking. Clara stopped talking for a moment. She folded her hands around the tea mug. I don't have words for what I saw, she said finally. I just know I've never seen my granddaughter look at me like that, like I was a lifeboat and she was watching me sail away. Ethan said nothing. He let the silence do its work. Victor left this morning, Clara continued. Business. He told Olivia he'd be back by tonight. She called me from a phone she borrowed from a neighbor. I don't think she's allowed to have her own anymore. And she was whispering. She said she was fine. She always says she's fine, but then she said, Clara's voice dropped so low Ethan had to lean slightly forward. She said, Grandma, I don't know if I can keep doing this. And then the call ended. How far is the farmhouse? 20 minutes up the mountain, maybe less on a good road. What's the road like in this weather? Clara looked at him with something between surprise and something older than surprise. The look of a person who suddenly realizes they've been talking to someone who's actually been listening. Muddy. One lane in places. Victor has a truck. We have my sedan. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Under the table, Atlas pressed his flank against Ethan's leg. Not restless, just present. You said Victor left this morning. Business. Do you know what time he left? She called me around 9. He must have left before that. Ethan checked the time. It was past 2 in the afternoon. You've been carrying this for 5 hours. Claire's jaw tightened. I drove to the county sheriff's office first. They told me they couldn't do anything unless there was evidence of a crime. They said Olivia was an adult. They said if she called them herself. She stopped, pressed her lips together. I went to 3 different places before I came here. This was just the last place before I ran out of places to try. Ethan turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. It was a habit, something to do with his hands when his mind was working. He thought about what he knew and what he didn't. Adult woman. No reported crime. No evidence of physical harm, at least not documented. A controlling partner who wasn't home. A grandmother whose fear had the specific texture of someone who has moved past panic into something quieter and more desperate. He thought about a lot of other things, too. Things he didn't say. When does Victor come back? She didn't know. Tonight, she said. She didn't say when. He looked at Clara directly. I need you to understand something before I say the next thing. I'm not law enforcement. I'm not going to go up there and do anything that makes this worse for Olivia. If she tells me she's fine and she wants me to leave, I'm going to leave. Clara held his gaze. And if she doesn't? Then we figure out what she actually needs. He stood up, dropped enough cash on the table to cover both their orders and then some, and looked at Atlas. Come on. Well, the road up to the property was exactly what Clara had described. And then some. Ethan drove his truck. A 12-year-old Ford F250 that had more miles on it than most people put on 2 vehicles, with Clara in the passenger seat and Atlas in the rear cab, standing with his paws on the center console because he'd never been good at sitting in moving vehicles, and Ethan had stopped fighting it years ago. The windshield wipers worked hard against the rain. The headlights carved maybe 30 feet of visibility through the dark and the weather. He drove without the radio on. He drove the way he'd been taught to move through unfamiliar terrain. Steady, deliberate, reading the environment. The mountain road narrowed twice. There were no other vehicles. The trees on either side were dense enough that a person standing 10 feet off the road wouldn't be visible from a vehicle. He noted the turnoffs, 2 of them, both unmarked, both heading into tree lines that could lead anywhere or nowhere. He didn't say any of this to Clara. She was already at the edge of what she could manage. Tell me about Victor, he said instead. What do you want to know? Whatever you know. What he does? How he handles himself? Whether he's ever... Ethan paused. Whether there's been anything physical. Clara was quiet for a beat too long. There was a bruise, she said finally, on Olivia's arm, about 8 months ago. She said she caught it on a door frame. Ethan nodded and didn't say anything. Victor was military, I think, Clara added. Marines or something. Olivia mentioned it once. He never talked about it, she said. She said he didn't like to. Ethan adjusted his grip on the wheel. Okay, he said. The farmhouse appeared through the rain like a shape that had been waiting for them. A low, wide structure set back from the road at the end of a gravel drive that had turned largely to standing water. A covered porch, a single lamp burning behind curtains, a dark barn structure to the left, 2 vehicles in the driveway. A late-model black Ram 1500 with Montana plates, and a smaller SUV with mud on the quarter panels. Ethan stopped the truck at the end of the driveway. He didn't pull in. He sat there for a long moment, looking at the house. I thought you said Victor left, he said. Clara leaned forward, squinting through the rain. When she saw the black Ram, The color went out of her face. That's his truck. Atlas growled. Low, almost inaudible, the sound he made when he was certain about something he didn't have words to describe. Ethan looked at the house for another 3 seconds. He looked at the porch. He looked at the curtains and the thin edge of light beneath them, and the way one curtain had moved a fraction since they pulled up, the way it does when someone inside is looking out without wanting to be seen looking. Stay in the truck, he said to Clara. Ethan, I mean it. He said it without heat. If I come back out without Olivia, or if you hear anything that sounds wrong, I want you to drive back down the mountain and call 911. You don't wait for me. You just go. Clara grabbed his arm with both hands, and her grip was stronger than he expected. Please, she said. Please bring her out. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once. He opened the door and stepped out into the rain. Atlas moved to follow. Stay, Ethan said softly. The dog sat, but his eyes didn't leave Ethan. The gravel crunched under his boots as he walked up the drive. The rain hit his shoulders, his hair, the back of his neck. He kept his hands visible, his pace unhurried, his breathing slow. A discipline so deeply ingrained it happened without permission, the way soldiers breathe when they're about to cross a threshold and don't know what's waiting on the other side. He climbed the porch steps, raised his hand, knocked. The silence that followed lasted long enough that a different kind of man might have knocked again, or called out, or stepped back. Ethan stood still and waited, because waiting is its own kind of pressure, and he'd learned that a long time ago in places the people inside this house had never seen and never would. Then the lock turned. The door opened 6 inches, and Olivia Bennett looked out at him through the gap, and Ethan saw, in the fraction of a second before she composed her face, exactly what her grandmother had been trying to describe. Not bruises, not blood, something harder to name than either of those things. The look of someone who has been alone inside their own life for so long, they've started to forget what it felt like to be seen. Can I help you? She said. Her voice was even, practiced. And then, from somewhere behind her, deeper in the house, came a voice that wasn't hers. Olivia. One word. Said the way men say a word when the word is not a word, when it's a signal, a boundary, a door that just slammed shut. Olivia's expression didn't change. That was the thing that hit Ethan hardest. Her expression didn't change because she'd learned not to let it. I'm fine, she said, without him asking. She'd been saying that sentence for a very long time. Behind her, the footsteps started coming closer. The footsteps were unhurried. That was the first thing Ethan registered. Not rushed, not startled, but slow and deliberate. The kind of footsteps that belong to a man who has never once in his life felt the need to hurry toward anything because he already knows how every room ends when he walks into it. Victor Hale filled the doorway behind Olivia the way weather fills a window. Completely, unavoidably, with a pressure that changed the air quality on both sides of the glass. He was taller than Ethan had pictured from Claire's description. Not just tall, but built with that particular density that comes from years of structured physical training rather than casual effort. Mid-40s, maybe. Dark hair going silver at the temples, a jaw that could have been drawn with a straight edge. He was wearing a flannel shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he looked entirely too comfortable in his own house, which was exactly the point. He looked at Ethan the way men look at things they haven't decided whether to bother with yet. Can I help you? He said, and it wasn't a question. It had the cadence of a question, but none of the intent. The verbal equivalent of a door being held open just long enough to show you it can also be shut. Evening, Ethan said. Sorry to come up unannounced. I was down at Loretta's café and ran into a woman who said she was looking for this address, said she was family. He kept his voice easy, neighborly, the kind of tone that costs nothing and reveals nothing. Wanted to make sure she found the right place. Victor looked at him for a beat too long. What woman? Older lady, white hair, gray coat. Said her name was Clara, Olivia said very quietly. The name landed differently on the two of them. On Olivia, it landed like something she was trying not to reach for. On Victor, it landed like a stone dropped into still water, a small surface disturbance, rings spreading outward. Clara's not expected, Victor said. No, I gathered that, Ethan said. She seemed pretty worried, though. Weather's bad up here, and she didn't want to drive the road alone. I offered to come up ahead of her, make sure everything was all right. It was a reasonable story, true in its bones, if not in every particular. Ethan had found over the years that the best misdirection is mostly accurate. It's the details that do the work, not the invention. Victor studied him. You a neighbor? No, just passing through town. I've got a shop down in Harlan. Mechanic. Something moved behind Victor's eyes. A recalibration, brief and nearly invisible. Ethan caught it. He was supposed to catch it. Victor had looked at him and run the same kind of assessment Ethan had run on Victor, and had arrived at, not a threat, a mechanic. Nobody. Which was fine. Olivia, Victor said, and he said it with a particular patience, the kind that has teeth under it. Why don't you tell your grandmother's friend that everything is fine up here? Olivia turned her face slightly toward Ethan. She was 35 years old, and she had good cheekbones and dark circles under her eyes, and she was wearing a long-sleeved shirt in a house that was too warm for long sleeves, and she looked at Ethan with an expression so carefully assembled it must have taken practice. Everything is fine, she said. Ethan looked at her for a moment. That's good to hear. He paused. Your grandmother's been sitting in my truck for about 20 minutes. She was really hoping to see you, even just for a few minutes. Another pause. Relaxed. Unhurried. Would that be all right? The question was directed at Olivia, and they all three knew it. Victor answered it. It's not a great time. I understand that, Ethan said. Like I said, I'm sorry to intrude. I'll just let Clara know she can... I'll come out. Olivia said it quietly and quickly, like a sentence that had to leave her mouth before she could think about it too long. She didn't look at Victor when she said it. She looked at her own hands. The silence that followed lasted maybe 4 seconds and felt like 4 minutes. It's raining, Victor said, and his voice had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way a stranger would notice, but the patience in it had gotten thinner, like ice in early spring. You're going to get soaked. I'll get my jacket. She turned away from the door. Victor let her go, but his eyes moved from her retreating back to Ethan's face with a very specific intentionality. He was making sure Ethan understood that he was letting her go, that this was a choice he was making, not a concession he'd been forced into. Ethan held the man's gaze and said nothing at all. They stood on opposite sides of a threshold, two men who had each spent years learning to read a room, and neither of them moved. Victor spoke first. You said you have a shop in Harlan. That's right. Long drive on a night like this. I was already in town, like I said. You said you were passing through. Ethan let a beat pass. I was passing through when I stopped for coffee. Now I'm stopped. Victor smiled. It was technically a smile. The mouth moved in the right direction, but it didn't make it to his eyes, and the eyes were where it mattered. I appreciate you looking out for an old woman, he said. That's decent of you, really. The word decent came out like a coin placed on a table, visible, deliberate, carrying the specific weight of a man who uses language the same way he might use furniture to block a doorway. It wasn't anything, Ethan said. Olivia reappeared with a jacket, dark green, oversized in the shoulders, probably his, and she stepped past Victor into the doorway, and Victor's hand came up and rested on her shoulder for just a moment as she passed. Not grabbing, not forceful, just there. A hand that reminded her of something without saying what. She came out onto the porch. Ethan stepped back to give her room, and she pulled the jacket tighter around herself and looked out at the rain in the dark driveway. And he watched her take in the shape of his truck at the end of the drive, the passenger side window lit faintly from inside. Her throat moved. She's really out there, Olivia said. Not to Ethan, really, just to the air. She's been looking for you for a while, he said quietly. Victor hadn't moved from the doorway. He was leaning against the frame now, arms crossed, and he had adopted a particular expression. Relaxed, slightly amused, the look of a man watching something minor unfold with total confidence in how it ends. Olivia went down the porch steps. Ethan walked behind her and slightly to her left, close enough to be present, far enough to give her the decision of the distance. The gravel was waterlogged and uneven, and she moved across it carefully, head down against the rain, and he watched the set of her shoulders and the angle of her neck and the way her arms were pulled in close to her body, all of it telling him the same thing her words hadn't. The truck door opened before they reached it. Clara came out into the rain without hesitating, which was exactly what Ethan expected of her. and she crossed the distance to her granddaughter in a few fast steps and wrapped both arms around her, and Olivia went rigid for a second, one single second of a body that had learned to be careful about being touched, before something in her gave way, and she put her face against her grandmother's shoulder and held on. Ethan kept walking, circling to the driver's side. He opened his door, leaned in, and scratched Atlas behind the ear. The dog leaned into it. "Good boy," he murmured. He looked back over the roof of the truck. Victor was still on the porch, still watching, still wearing the expression of a man who believes he's in control of the ending and is waiting for everyone else to figure that out. Ethan made a decision. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and dialed. It rang twice. Then, "Benton County Dispatch, what is your emergency?" "This isn't an emergency," Ethan said, which was partially true. "I'm at a property outside Silver Creek on County Road 9, approximately 4 miles north of the Clearwater Junction. I'm with a woman who has concerns about a family member at this address, and I'd like to have an officer come out and do a welfare check." He paused. "The individual in question is an adult female, 35 years old. There are no reported injuries at this time, but the family believes she may be in a controlled situation. I'd appreciate if you could send someone out." A pause on the line. "Can I get your name, sir?" "Ethan Caldwell." He spelled it. "I'll be here when they arrive." When he ended the call and looked back at the porch, Victor was no longer wearing the amused expression. He was just watching, and the watching was different now. The wait for the officers took 31 minutes, which Ethan spent in a specific kind of focused stillness that most people who knew him wouldn't have recognized as anything but patience. He sat on the tailgate of the truck with the rain coming down and kept one eye on the house and one half ear on the conversation happening through the cab's open rear window. Clara talking to Olivia in low, careful tones, Olivia responding in short sentences that were slowly getting longer. Victor had gone inside after about 10 minutes. That was fine. That was actually preferable. A man like that would be calculating in private rather than posturing in public. And calculating men were easier to manage than reactive ones. The porch light was still on. The curtain moved twice. Ethan had called Victor military from the first 30 seconds. The way he stood, the way he held his weight, the particular quality of his stillness. These were not civilian stillnesses. They were trained stillnesses. And Clara had said Marines, maybe, something Olivia mentioned once. Ethan believed that. He also believed it had been a while since Victor had been in any kind of structure or accountability. Because men like that, when they lose the structure, sometimes try to rebuild it in the closest space available, which was usually the people around them. He'd known men like Victor. Not many, but enough. They weren't simple. They weren't cartoons. That was the thing civilians never quite understood about this particular type of danger. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. It didn't look like what they'd been taught to recognize. It looked like someone who was extremely good at being in a room. Atlas jumped up on the tailgate without invitation and sat beside him, pressing his shoulder into Ethan's arm. "I know," Ethan said. The headlights came up the road at 7:42 p.m. 2 vehicles, a white sheriff's SUV and a county cruiser behind it. They pulled in behind Ethan's truck, and the officers who got out were a woman in her 30s with her dark hair pulled back under her cap and a younger man who moved like he was still learning how much space his own body took up in a situation like this. The woman's nameplate said Torres. The younger one said Reed. Officer Torres looked at Ethan first. She had the eyes of someone who had learned to read a scene rather than a face. "You called in the welfare check?" "Yes, ma'am." "You're Caldwell?" "That's right." She looked at the house, then back at him. "What's your relationship to the individuals at this address?" "None. I met the grandmother." He gestured toward Clara, who had gotten out of the truck and was standing with her arm around Olivia. "At Loretta's café, about 90 minutes ago. She explained the situation. I offered to drive her up." Torres looked at Clara and Olivia for a moment. Her expression didn't give much away, but her eyes were working. "And the individual inside?" "Victor Hale. He was here when we arrived. He went inside about 20 minutes ago." Reed was writing something in his notepad. Torres looked at Ethan with a directness that wasn't unfriendly, but wasn't casual either. You prior service? It wasn't an aggressive question. She'd read the posture, the patience, the fact that he'd called the right number and given the right information in the right order. She was just confirming what she already suspected. Army, he said. Out 7 years. She nodded once. All right, stay with the ladies. We'll go make contact. She and Reed went up the drive toward the house, and Ethan watched them go, and he felt the particular tension of a man who has handed something off and now has to trust the handoff. It was one of the harder things, after years of being the person who handled it directly. The stepping back. The trusting the process. He wasn't always good at it. Olivia was watching the officers approach the house, with her arms crossed tight over her stomach and her jaw set. Clara touched her arm. It's all right. He's going to be... Olivia stopped. Started again. He's very calm when he talks to people. He's very good at it. I know, Clara said. He's going to make it sound like I'm... She stopped again. Ethan turned toward her, not intrusively, just so she knew he was there. You don't have to explain him, he said. You just have to tell them the truth about you. Olivia looked at him. She had her grandmother's same quality of attention, the way she focused, like she was measuring not just words, but what was underneath them. And if they believe him instead? Then we figure out the next step, Ethan said. Tonight isn't the end of anything. It's just the first night. He didn't say it to make her feel better. He said it because it was accurate, and she seemed like someone who needed accurate more than she needed comfort right now. She turned back toward the house. Torres was on the porch, knocking. The door opened. Even from the distance of the driveway, Ethan could see the change in Victor's body language when he found law enforcement instead of just the mechanic from Harlan. The adjustment was subtle. Not alarmed, men like Victor don't alarm easily. But it was there. The conversation on the porch lasted several minutes. Torres did most of the talking, and from the angle in her posture, Ethan could read that she was keeping it straightforward, identifying herself, explaining the welfare check, asking basic questions. Reed stood 2 steps back and to the left, which was correct positioning, and Ethan revised his assessment of the younger officer slightly upward. Then Torres looked back toward the driveway. Then she said something to Victor. Victor looked toward the driveway too, and the distance didn't mask the direction of his gaze. He was looking at Olivia, and only at Olivia, the way you look at something you believe belongs to you when someone else picks it up. Olivia saw it. She took a small step sideways, closer to Clara, without appearing to notice she'd done it. But she'd done it. Torres came back down the drive. She stopped in front of Olivia, and her voice changed. Not softer exactly, but more deliberate, more human. Ms. Bennett, I'm Officer Torres. Can I ask you a few questions? Olivia nodded. Are you here voluntarily? A pause. The rain fell. Yes. Torres held her gaze. Do you feel safe? Olivia opened her mouth, closed it, looked down at the gravel for a moment, then back up. I feel safe right now, she said. Out here. It was a small thing, 2 extra words. But Torres heard them. Ethan saw it in the small shift of her head, the way she glanced once at Reed before looking back at Olivia. Can you tell me how long you've been living at this property? And Olivia started talking. It didn't come out in a flood. That wasn't how it worked, Ethan knew. It almost never did. It came out in careful, measured pieces, the way someone speaks when they've been trained by experience to expect that what they say will be used against them later. She talked about the house, and the routine, and the phone, and the fact that she didn't drive anymore because Victor had explained very reasonably that the road was bad and she wasn't used to mountain driving, and it had just become the way things were. She didn't use the word control once. She didn't have to. Reed was writing in his notepad and not looking up, which was correct. Less eye contact means people keep talking. And Torres was listening with the focused stillness of someone taking a deposition rather than a statement, every detail going somewhere behind her eyes. Victor came down off the porch. He hadn't been invited to, but he came down off the porch anyway, and he crossed the gravel with his hands in his pockets, and a look on his face like he was mildly inconvenienced by a situation he was confident he was about to resolve. Olivia, he said, you don't have to do this. Torres stepped into his path. Not dramatically, just materially. The movement of a woman who has placed her body between people in a professional capacity enough times that it's become reflexive. Sir, I need you to stay back, please. Victor looked at Torres with the expression of a man who has never once in his adult life been told to stay back by anyone and has developed, over time, a particular response to the experience. I'm just talking to my partner, he said, very reasonably, very calmly. And I'm asking you to give us some space while I finish my interview. A beat. Victor looked from Torres to Olivia, and Olivia was looking at the gravel again, the way she always did when she felt him looking at her in that specific way. Of course, Victor said. Take your time. He stepped back, stood there in the rain without seeming to notice it, hands still in his pockets, and waited. And the waiting was a thing in itself. It took up space. It cast a shadow over the driveway in a way that had nothing to do with the light. Ethan watched Victor watch Olivia, and he thought about what it costs a person to speak honestly when the person they're afraid of is standing 12 feet away listening to every word. He picked up his thermos from the truck cab, walked around to where Olivia was standing, and held it out. Coffee, he said quietly. It's bad, but it's hot. Olivia looked at it, then at him. Something crossed her face that wasn't quite a smile, but was maybe the ancestor of one. She took it. She wrapped both hands around it and held it close and kept talking. And Ethan stepped back and stood in the rain and let her. Across the driveway, Victor was still watching. The porch light threw his shadow long across the gravel, all the way to where Olivia was standing, falling just short of her feet. Just short, but close enough. Reed closed his notepad, caught Ethan's eye across the distance, and gave a very small nod that meant nothing officially and everything practically, and Torres put a hand briefly on Olivia's arm and said something too quiet to hear. And somewhere up in the dark tree line above the farmhouse, a branch broke under the weight of accumulated rain and fell into the dark below. Victor shifted his weight from one foot to the other. It was the first uncontrolled movement Ethan had seen him make all night. And in the particular language of men who have spent time in dangerous places, Ethan Caldwell read that shift for exactly what it was. The room was changing, and Victor Hale knew it. Victor moved again. Not toward Torres, not toward Reed. He moved toward Olivia, and he did it with the specific, unhurried confidence of a man who has never once had to rush toward something because the thing has always, eventually, come back to him on its own. Olivia. His voice was measured, reasonable, the voice of a man explaining something obvious to someone who keeps missing the point. You're tired, and you're upset, and you're standing in the rain talking to people you don't know. Come inside. Torres stepped forward. Sir, I'm not speaking to you. Still reasonable, still calm, just a man talking to his partner, just a domestic situation being handled by people who understood it better than any outsider could. Olivia didn't move. That was the thing. She heard him, she registered him, and she didn't move. Her hands tightened around Ethan's thermos, and she kept her eyes on Torres, and she didn't move. Victor stopped 2 feet from her. Up close, the height differential was more pronounced. He had a good 5 inches on her, and he used it the way tall men sometimes do, not aggressively, but gravitationally, as though the space between them had a lean to it. You're going to make yourself sick, he said. Softer now, almost tender. You know how you get in the cold. It was a precise thing to say. It sounded like concern. It was also a reminder. I know your body. I know your patterns. I know what happens to you, and you need me to tell you. And Ethan watched Olivia process it, watched the small war that moved through her face in the span of about 2 seconds, and he kept his own body very still. I'm okay, Olivia said. You're not. Victor reached out and touched her elbow. What happened next was small and enormous at the same time. Olivia flinched. Not a big flinch. Not a dramatic visible recoil. A small internal one. Her elbow pulled a 1/4 inch before she stopped it, before the learned discipline kicked in and smoothed it over. But the 1/4 inch was there, and Torres saw it, and Reed saw it, and Ethan saw it, and Victor saw that they saw it, and for the first time all evening, the careful composure on Victor Hale's face developed a crack in it. He let go of her elbow. Officer, he said, turning to Torres, and his voice had changed, still controlled but working harder at it now. like an engine running above its comfortable RPM range. I don't know what she's been told or what her grandmother has been filling her head with, but Olivia is here of her own choice, and she's free to leave any time she wants. I've never prevented her from Mr. Hale. Torres said it without raising her voice, which made it more effective. I need you to step back to the porch. I have every right to... Sir. Reed, younger, less practiced, but he put some actual weight behind it this time. Porch, please. Something moved through Victor's expression. A calculation, fast and nearly invisible. The kind that happens when a man who is very good at reading rooms reads a room and doesn't like what he finds. He was looking at Torres, then Reed, then Ethan, and Ethan watched the calculation happen in real time, watched Victor arrive at the same conclusion Ethan had arrived at from the opposite direction. The room had changed, and posturing was now costing more than it was buying. He stepped back. He walked to the porch, climbed the steps, and leaned against the railing with his arms crossed. And the look on his face was the look of a man filing things away for later. Torres turned back to Olivia. Her voice dropped. Ms. Bennett, I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to take your time before you answer. Do you want to leave this property tonight? The rain fell. Up on the porch, Victor was very still. Olivia looked at her grandmother, who was standing 3 feet away and not saying a word, who was just there, the way she'd been just there for 78 years of being someone's person. Yes, Olivia said. The word came out barely above a whisper, like it had traveled a very long distance to get there. Yes, I want to leave. Torres nodded. Professionally, carefully, but she nodded. Okay, do you have anything inside you need to take with you? My purse, my phone. I don't know where my phone is. There are some clothes. We'll go in with you to get your things. Olivia looked up at the porch. Victor was watching her with an expression that had gone very flat, the way water goes flat right before the temperature drops enough to freeze it. He wasn't saying anything. He was just watching. And the watching was doing the work that words had been doing all night. Ethan stepped forward, not in front of Olivia, beside her and slightly offset, the same way he'd positioned himself at the cafe door so she could see him clearly. I'll be right here, he said. Take whatever time you need. She looked at him. She nodded. And then she walked toward the porch with Torres on her left and Reed a few steps back, and she climbed the steps and passed Victor without looking at him, and Victor's head turned to follow her as she went inside, and the screen door swung shut behind the three of them. Ethan and Victor stood in the rain, 30 feet of gravel and dark air between them. Clara came to stand at Ethan's right shoulder. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Victor looked at Ethan across the distance and spoke conversationally, like they were two men at a backyard barbecue who'd just been introduced. You drive all the way up here for a woman you met an hour ago. About 90 minutes, Ethan said. That's a long way to go for a stranger. Not really. Victor was quiet for a moment. His jaw shifted slightly. You married? Ethan looked at him. No? Kids? No. So you just... Victor made a small gesture with his hand, a vague wave that was meant to encompass the evening, the rain, the situation, and the general absurdity of a mechanic from Harlan driving up a mountain to involve himself in something that wasn't his business. You just insert yourself into situations. When it seems worth it, Ethan said. Another silence. Victor looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him with the particular expression of a 78-year-old woman who has outlived better men than this and knows it. Victor looked away first. Inside the house there was movement, footsteps, the sound of a closet or drawer. Torres's voice saying something too muffled to parse through the walls and rain. It went on for several minutes. Ethan tracked it peripherally without making it obvious he was tracking it, the same way he used to track sound signatures in buildings he hadn't cleared yet. Then the footsteps came back toward the door. Then they stopped. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Ethan's attention sharpened, the kind of sharpening that happens below the level of decision, before the conscious mind has finished processing the input. Then Olivia's voice came through the door. Not panicked. Worse than panicked. Completely flat, The voice of someone who has just had something they hoped for taken away before they fully had it. Victor, where is it? Victor's expression didn't change. Where is what? My purse, it was on the hook. I don't know what you're talking about. A pause. Then Torres's voice, still calm, still professional, but with an edge under it now. Mr. Hale, is there somewhere else the item might be? I told you, I don't know what she's talking about. Victor unfolded his arms and moved toward the door, and the way he moved changed. The casual ease of a man in his own space reasserting itself, that particular proprietary comfort that says I know where everything is and you don't, and that's the point. Let me come in and help her look. Reed moved to intercept. Sir, the officers asked that you remain. I live here. Not loud, not aggressive, just certain. I have a right to be inside my own home. He was correct, legally, and they all knew it, and Victor knew they knew it. And Reed looked at Torres through the screen door with the expression of a young officer discovering that legal and right are not the same category. Torres came out onto the porch. She pulled the screen door closed behind her and looked at Victor with the professional blankness of a woman who has had this exact moment before and has learned what it costs to react to it visibly. Mr. Hale, Miss Bennett's belongings don't appear to be where she says she left them. Her purse, her phone, and several items of clothing. Things get moved, Victor said. I don't track where she puts things. She says the phone is particularly important. She can use mine. Mr. Hale, she. He said it with a precision that was its own kind of violence. Can use mine. A pause. As she always has. The air on the porch got very still. Torres looked at him for a long moment. Then she went back inside. Ethan had been watching Victor's hands through all of this, because that's where it matters, and the hands were steady, and the steadiness was information. Victor was not losing control. Victor was operating, adjusting, reading, managing the situation with the competence of a man who had spent a great deal of time learning how to manage situations without ever appearing to manage them. The difference between a reactive, dangerous man and a calculating one is that the reactive kind you can see coming. Victor stepped off the porch and walked toward Ethan. He walked unhurried, hands at his sides, and he stopped about 6 feet away, close enough for the conversation to be private, far enough that it couldn't be read as physical intimidation. He had, Ethan understood, assessed the space and chosen it deliberately. The calculation was good. A lesser observer would have missed it. I don't know who you are, Victor said. His voice was very quiet, almost friendly. But I want to be honest with you, one man to another. What's happening here? What Clara has convinced herself is happening, what she's convinced Olivia is happening, it's not what you think. Olivia has had problems, mental health, I mean. She goes through periods where He paused, as though choosing his words carefully out of compassion rather than strategy. She misperceives things. She loses things and forgets she lost them. She gets frightened for reasons that don't track with reality. I have been nothing but supportive of her through all of that. That's not easy. It requires patience. He tilted his head slightly. You understand that. It was well done. Ethan gave it that. It was genuinely, technically well done. The framing, the apparent vulnerability, the appeal to masculine solidarity, the preemptive discrediting. If Ethan had been what Victor had decided he was, a civilian, a nobody, a man who noticed things occasionally but didn't understand what he was looking at, it might have worked. I appreciate you saying that, Ethan said. Victor waited for the rest of it. Ethan let the silence sit. She flinched, Ethan said finally, very quietly. Not an accusation, just a fact. When you touched her arm, she flinched. Victor's jaw tightened. A small movement. The first real one. People flinch, he said. Yeah, Ethan said. They do. Usually there's a reason. The two men looked at each other. And this was the moment. Not dramatic, not loud, nothing that would have appeared significant to a casual observer, where something shifted between them. Because Victor looked at Ethan and finished, finally, the assessment he'd been running all evening. And what he found in Ethan's face wasn't a mechanic from Harlan being accidentally brave. What he found was something quieter and considerably less convenient. A man who was not afraid of him, not performing bravery, not suppressing fear, genuinely, constitutionally, at baseline, not afraid. The way people are when they have stood in places where fear is a luxury and have come out the other side of that understanding. Victor had been in the military. He knew what that looked like. He recognized the specific texture of it, and recognizing it, he recalibrated for the last time. "You should mind your business," he said, and the friendly quality was gone from his voice now, stripped down to the thing underneath, which was flat and cold and honest in a way the friendliness had never been. "I'm going to," Ethan said. "Once Olivia gets her things and leaves." Something moved in Victor's eyes. "And if I told you her things aren't here?" "Then I'd ask Officer Torres to document that." "And if I told you Olivia isn't leaving?" Ethan held his gaze. "She already said she is." Victor let out a breath through his nose, a sharp, short exhale that wasn't quite a laugh. He looked down for a moment, the first time his eyes had dropped all night, and when he looked back up, the calculation was done and the answer was in his face. And the answer was that the next move was one he hadn't intended to make and didn't like. He stepped toward the porch, and then the screen door opened. Olivia came out with a single bag, smaller than what she'd described, smaller than what she should have had. And Torres behind her, and the expression on Olivia's face was the expression of someone who has decided to leave a burning building and is not going to stop to save the furniture. Her purse wasn't there. Her phone wasn't there. She had a canvas bag with some clothes and a book and whatever else she'd been able to put her hands on in the 10 minutes she'd had. And she was coming down the porch steps, and she wasn't looking at Victor. He stepped into her path, not blocking. Technically, not blocking. Just standing in the direction she was moving, close enough that she'd have to navigate around him, and his voice went soft again. The other soft. The one Ethan now understood was the most dangerous register he had. "Olivia, think about what you're doing." She stopped, 3 steps from him. The rain came down between them. "You don't have anywhere to go," he said. "Claire's house is 2 hours away. You haven't driven in months. You don't have your phone. You don't have—" "Mr. Hale." Torres, sharp this time, the professional patience finally running thin at its edges. "Step aside. I'm speaking to my partner. Step aside. Now." He didn't move. And Ethan moved. Not fast, not dramatically. He walked from where he was standing to the base of the porch steps, and he positioned himself between Victor and the path to his truck, and he did all of it without any particular urgency, like a man crossing a room to close a window. He didn't touch Victor. He didn't threaten him. He didn't do anything that a camera would have captured as aggressive. He just stood there, in the specific way that men stand when they are done negotiating and have not yet begun the next thing, and the space between those two states is itself a message. Victor looked at him. Ethan looked back. And in the 17 years since he'd left the army, through the workshop, the quiet town, the coffee and the solitude and the deliberate ordinariness of a life built to stay below a certain decibel level, Ethan had almost convinced himself that the man he used to be was gone, retired, like Atlas, put to pasture, safe to ignore. He hadn't been sure until this moment whether that was true. Now he knew. Victor stepped aside. He did it slowly, without breaking eye contact, and he carried the careful composure of a man preserving something even in retreat, but he stepped aside. Olivia walked past him. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes straight ahead and she walked to the truck, and Clara was already there, already holding the door, and Olivia climbed in and sat down and put the canvas bag on her lap and stared straight forward through the windshield, and Atlas turned in the back seat and pushed his big head gently over the center console toward her, the way he'd done once or twice for people in bad shape at the end of long days in worse places. Olivia put her hand on the dog's head. She didn't cry. She just sat there with her hand on Atlas and breathed. Torres was beside Ethan. Reed was documenting something near the cruiser. Victor had gone back onto the porch and stood there in the yellow light with his arms at his sides, watching the driveway, and the patience that had defined his entire evening had finally gone out of his face, leaving something raw beneath it, something that was probably closer to who he actually was. "We're going to need a formal statement from Ms. Bennett," Torres said quietly, Tonight, if possible. She'll give one, Ethan said. Can you bring her down to the county office? Yes. Torres looked at him for a moment, the same direct look she'd given him at the start. You did a good thing tonight, she said. Ethan shook his head slightly. I just drove up a mountain. She accepted that without comment, because she was a person who understood understatement. He walked to his truck, opened the driver's door, and climbed in. Claire was in the back with Olivia, one arm around her, saying nothing, just there. Atlas had returned to the rear cab and was pressed against Olivia's left side with the authority of a dog who has made a unilateral decision about where he's needed. Ethan started the engine, turned on the heat, put the truck in reverse. He didn't look back at the house. He didn't need to. He knew what was there. A man on a porch in the rain, watching the driveway, doing the only thing still available to him, which was to watch. The gravel crunched under the tires. The headlights swept across the dark tree line as he turned. The road back down the mountain was still muddy, still narrow, still unlit except for what the truck could make ahead of itself, which wasn't much. But it was enough. In the back seat, Olivia said something. It was so quiet Ethan almost missed it. I forgot what it felt like, she said. To just get in a car and leave. Clara held her tighter. Ethan drove. The farmhouse disappeared in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the rain and the dark and the distance, and the road ahead opened up the way roads do when you've come through the narrowest part. Behind them, the porch light at the farmhouse burned on against the dark. Alone now. The county sheriff's substation in Silver Creek was a single-story building that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, with fluorescent lights that buzzed at a frequency just below the threshold of conscious annoyance, but well within the range of cumulative exhaustion. There were 4 desks, 2 of which were occupied, a row of filing cabinets along the back wall, and a small waiting area with plastic chairs that had been bolted to the floor sometime in the 90s and hadn't been replaced since. Ethan sat in one of those chairs with his elbows on his knees and a paper cup of water he hadn't touched, and he waited. Atlas lay across his feet. The dog had been allowed inside without discussion. Torres had held the door and looked at the shepherd and looked at Ethan and made a quiet judgment call, the kind that doesn't get written into any report. It was 10:47 at night. The rain had dropped to a mist outside, the kind that doesn't feel like weather until you've been standing in it for 10 minutes and realize you're soaked. Olivia was in a room at the back with Torres. Clara was in a chair 2 seats down from Ethan, and she was doing what she'd been doing for the better part of the last hour, sitting with her hands folded and her eyes on the middle distance, not sleeping, not talking, just enduring the particular vigil of someone who has been worried for so long that stillness has become its own kind of effort. At some point she said, "Are you hungry?" Ethan looked at her. "No. I could find something." "Clara, sit." She settled back. A minute passed. "How are you so calm?" He thought about that honestly. "I'm not," he said. "I'm just quiet about it." She accepted that, turned it over, and seemed to find it sufficient. Reed came through this back hallway at 11:03, carrying 2 cups of actual coffee from somewhere, and he handed one to Clara without being asked, which elevated Ethan's assessment of him again. He was young, maybe 26, 27, and he moved through the substation with the particular self-consciousness of someone still figuring out how much authority they actually have versus how much they're supposed to project. But he was paying attention, which covered a lot of ground. "Miss Bennett is doing well," he said, which was the professional version of "she's holding together." "Officer Torres expects another 30, 40 minutes. Clara wrapped both hands around the coffee. "And then what happens?" Reed sat down across from them. He had his notepad on his knee, closed, which meant this wasn't official. "That depends on some things. What Ms. Bennett wants to do next, what she wants to file, what she's willing to put in a statement." He paused. "A lot of it is her call." "And Victor?" "Right now he hasn't done anything we can charge him with tonight." Reed said it carefully, like a man aware of how insufficient it sounds. "We can document everything, the restricted access, the missing phone, what she told us about the last 2 years. That creates a record. But coercive control is—" He stopped, started again. "The law is still catching up to what it actually looks like." Clara looked at the floor. "So he just stays up there?" "Tonight, yes." Reed held her gaze. I'm sorry, that's not the answer you need. No, she said, it's not. Ethan had been listening without appearing to listen, which was a thing he did without deciding to. He turned the paper cup in his hands. Was there documentation of the phone situation? Her not having one of her own? Reed looked at him. Torres noted it. And the missing purse, the clothes that weren't where she said they were. That's documented too. Can you pull his record? A small pause. I can't share that with you. I'm not asking you to share it. I'm asking if you can pull it. Reed looked at him with an expression that was trying to decide something. Why? He said Marines, Ethan said. Or Clara said Olivia mentioned Marines. I want to know if that's accurate and what his discharge looked like. You think that matters? I think a man who knows how to manage a situation the way he managed that driveway tonight didn't learn it selling insurance. Ethan set the cup down. And I think if there's a pattern, it won't start with Olivia. Reed was quiet for a moment. He opened his notepad, wrote something, closed it again. He didn't confirm or deny anything, which was its own kind of answer. The back hallway door opened and Torres came through it, and behind her came Olivia. The change was small, but visible. Something in the posture, not straightened exactly, not the performance of confidence, but slightly less contracted than it had been at the farmhouse. The canvas bag was on her shoulder. Her eyes were red at the edges, but dry, and they moved around the room with the same watchfulness as before, except the watchfulness now had a slightly different quality to it. Less scanning for threat, more just taking inventory of where she was. She saw Clara and something crossed her face, quickly, that she didn't try to manage. Clara stood up without a word. They didn't speak for a moment. Clara held her granddaughter's face in both hands, the way you hold something you thought you'd lost, and looked at her, and Olivia closed her eyes briefly, and that was the whole of it. Torres looked at Ethan over their heads and gave a small nod that meant several things at once. He stood up. How'd she do? She was thorough, Torres said. It sounded like a compliment, and it was. She remembered dates, specific incidents, a pattern over 26 months. She's sharp. She always has been, Clara said, without turning around. Torres had her notepad out. She looked at Ethan with the direct quality he'd come to recognize as her default mode. I want to ask you some things about tonight. Sure. You contacted dispatch at approximately 7:41 p.m. You gave our operator a description of a potential coercive control situation. That's right. You used that specific phrase, coercive control. Yes. Torres looked at him steadily. That's a pretty specific term for a mechanic. Ethan held her gaze. I read. Torres didn't blink. Army Rangers, she said. It wasn't a question. Is that in your system, or... You told the operator your name. I looked you up while we were driving out. She said it plainly, not apologetically. 75th Ranger Regiment. 3 deployments, separated 2018. A pause. Purple Heart. Clara had turned around now. So had Olivia. Ethan looked at Torres with an expression that didn't give much back. That's accurate. You didn't mention any of that. It wasn't relevant. It's relevant to me, Torres said, because I want to understand what happened on that driveway tonight. Victor Hale has no documented history of physical violence. He's large, he's trained. Yes, I pulled his record. Former Marine, 8 years, honorable discharge. And he spent all night controlling that scene very competently. And then at a certain point he looked at you and stepped aside. She tilted her head slightly. What did he see? The substation was quiet. Reed had stopped writing. Clara was watching Ethan with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Someone who wasn't going to move, Ethan said. Just that? Just that. Torres looked at him for a long moment. He could tell she knew it wasn't the complete answer, and he could tell she also knew it was the only one he was going to give, and she made a pragmatic peace with that. All right, she said. She flipped to a new page in her notepad. I need your formal statement for tonight's incident, where you were, what you observed, the sequence of events. Whatever you need. They sat at one of the empty desks, and Ethan walked her through it. Arrival time, observations, the order of conversations, what he saw, what he heard, what he did and didn't do. He was specific and he was concise, and he did not editorialize because a statement is a statement. And the moment you start characterizing rather than describing is the moment a defense attorney takes it apart. Torres wrote steadily, asked precise clarifying questions, and didn't interrupt when he was in the middle of something. She was good at her job. He respected that. Halfway through, she looked up. The flinch. When Hale touched her arm. I observed it. You want to tell me exactly what you saw? She pulled her elbow approximately a quarter inch when he made contact, caught herself, smoothed it over. She'd had practice doing that. Torres wrote it down word for word. When they finished, she set the pen down and leaned back in her chair. This was the off-record posture. The notepad closed, the pen away, the slight shifting of register that meant she was now talking as a person and not as an officer writing a report. He's going to lawyer up by morning, she said. I know. We can get a protection order started, but it takes time and she has to initiate it. She knows. If he decides to come down from that mountain, he won't tonight. Ethan said it with a certainty that came from the same place as his assessment of the driveway. Tonight he's going to sit with it. He's going to run the scenarios. Men like that, they don't react immediately when they feel like they still have moves. He thinks he has moves. Torres looked at him. Does he? Some. Not as many as he thinks. She picked up her pen, tapped it once on the notepad cover, set it down again. We're going to need Olivia to stay accessible. If she moves around, changes locations without us knowing, it makes the documentation harder. She'll stay with Clara for now. And you? He looked at her. What about me? Are you going back to Harlan? He thought about it genuinely, the way you think about something when the honest answer isn't immediately obvious. He had a shop. He had 2 vehicles coming in Thursday morning. He had a life that was modest and manageable and exactly the size he'd built it to be, which had been the point. Probably in the next day or 2, he said. Torres nodded once. Leave me your number before you go. He took the card she slid across the desk and put it in his jacket pocket. Across the room, Olivia was sitting beside Clara with the canvas bag on the floor at her feet, and she was talking, really talking, not the careful sentences from the farmhouse. And Clara was listening with the focused attention of a person taking in something they've been waiting 2 years to hear. Olivia's hands moved when she talked. Ethan noticed that. She hadn't let her hands move at all at the farmhouse. Reed appeared at Ethan's shoulder with a refilled paper cup. You need anything? No, thank you. Reed stood there for a second, not leaving. He had something on his face that wasn't quite a question. Go ahead, Ethan said. I put the query in, Reed said quietly. For his record, full record, not just the discharge summary. He paused. Hale was investigated twice by military police, once in year 6 of service, once in year 7. Both times involved partners. Both times the cases were closed without action. Ethan looked at him. You were right, Reed said. She's not the first. It wasn't a surprise. It landed anyway. Document everything she gave you tonight, Ethan said. All of it. Because when this gets to a DA's office, the pattern is going to matter more than any single incident. Reed nodded. I know. He hesitated. I went to the academy thinking this job was going to be... I don't know what I thought it was going to be. Cleaner, Ethan said. Yeah. It's not. No. Reed looked over at Olivia and Clara. But tonight felt like something. Tonight was a start, Ethan said. Don't let anybody tell you it was more than that, and don't let anybody tell you it was less. Reed took that in, nodded once like a man filing something away, and went back to his desk. It was past midnight when Torres told them they were free to go. She walked them to the door with the specific manner of an officer who has done everything she can within the available framework and is clearly aware of where the framework ends, which is one of the harder things to carry in a job like hers. At the door, Olivia stopped. She turned to Ethan and stood there for a moment like she was trying to find the architecture for what she wanted to say and not quite locating it. You didn't know me, she said finally. He shook his head. No. You didn't know if I was going to... She stopped. I kept saying I was fine. I know. I said it like 8 times. 7, he said. But I wasn't counting. Something moved across her face, tired and complicated, and not without the beginning of something that would eventually become humor when enough time had passed. Why did you stop? She asked. At the cafe. Why did you actually stop? Ethan thought about that. He thought about Atlas raising his head, and the way she'd held the counter, and the particular quality of her grandmother's fear. And the truth was that he couldn't reduce it to one thing, so he gave her the honest version, which was incomplete. Your grandmother didn't look lost, he said. She looked like someone who knew exactly where she needed to be and was terrified she'd run out of time to get there. He paused. That seemed worth stopping for. Olivia looked at him for another moment. Then she reached out and shook his hand. Not the tentative gesture of someone being polite, but a real handshake, firm and brief, and turned and walked out into the mist with Clara beside her. Ethan watched them get to Clara's sedan, watched Clara open the passenger door and hold it, watched Olivia duck inside. Torres appeared at his shoulder. She's going to need time. I know. This doesn't end tonight. I know that too. Hale will contest everything. He'll have a story ready by morning and someone to tell it to. Probably. Torres looked at the parking lot. The purse turned up, by the way. Reed went back out with another unit after you left the property. It was in a locked drawer in the bedroom. Phone was in there, too. Screen cracked. She said it without inflection, which was its own inflection. Ethan said nothing. He says she broke it herself, Torres said. During an argument. Of course he does. We photographed everything. A pause. The crack pattern on the screen is inconsistent with a drop. It's consistent with being pressed against a hard edge. Ethan looked at her. It's in the report, she said. Every last thing. He held out his hand. She shook it. He walked to his truck. Atlas was in the cab, awake, watching him cross the parking lot with the alert patience of a dog who has been waiting his whole life for whatever was going to happen next and has made his peace with the waiting. Ethan climbed in, sat there for a moment with the engine off, hands on the wheel, looking at the dark street outside the substation. The mist moved through the parking lot lights in slow, unhurried curtains. Somewhere down the block, a traffic signal changed colors for no one. He thought about Victor Hale on that porch in the rain. He thought about the flinch. He thought about a screen cracked against a hard edge, and a drawer with a lock, and a woman who had learned to say I'm fine until it became the most fluent language she had. He thought about the 2 cases that went nowhere in year 6 and year 7, and the woman or women who had carried whatever they'd carried in the years since, without documentation, without a record, without the start that tonight was supposed to be. He started the engine. Atlas put his chin on Ethan's shoulder from the back seat, heavy and warm, and entirely without ceremony. I know, Ethan said. He pulled out of the parking lot and drove through Silver Creek, past Loretta's Café, dark now and closed, its neon sign finally off for the night, and out onto the highway heading south toward Harlan. And the mountains were dark shapes against a sky that was starting, very slowly and without any drama, to show the first gray edge of something that wasn't quite dawn yet, but was working toward it. His phone buzzed on the seat beside him, a text from a number he didn't have saved. He glanced at it at a red light. This is Olivia. Clara gave me your number. I wanted to say thank you. I know that isn't enough, but I didn't want to not say it. He read it twice, looked back at the road. The light changed. He drove for another mile before he picked the phone up at the next red and typed back 2 words. Get some sleep. He set the phone down. The highway opened up ahead of him, long and empty and running straight through the dark. And somewhere behind him, the farmhouse on County Road 9 sat with its porch light on and its locked drawer emptied out, and a man inside who was doing whatever men like Victor Hale do in the small hours of the night when the room finally stops going their way. Ethan didn't think about that much. He thought about Clara's grip on his arm in the cafe. Please bring her out. He had. It wasn't everything. It wasn't clean. It wasn't finished and wouldn't be for a long time. And he was realistic enough about how these things worked to know that the road ahead for Olivia was going to be harder in some ways than the road behind her, because at least the road behind her was familiar. But she was in a car with her grandmother, and the drawer was empty. And for tonight, that was what had been possible. and Ethan Caldwell had learned a long time ago, in places and circumstances that had nothing and everything to do with a mountain road in Montana, that possible was not the same as enough, but it was where you had to start. Atlas settled in the back seat with a long exhale. The truck moved through the dark, and the mountains held their silence the way they always had, indifferent and enormous, keeping whatever they knew about the people moving through them to themselves. He got back to Harlan at 2:43 in the morning. The town was the kind of quiet that only exists in places small enough that everyone who lives there has somewhere to be the next day and the common sense to be in bed by 10. Main Street had 2 working streetlights, and one that had been flickering since September, and the sidewalks were empty and damp and reflecting the orange glow of the ones that worked in long, thin lines across the wet pavement. Ethan's shop sat at the south end of the main block, a converted 2-bay garage with a hand-painted sign above the door that said Caldwell Auto in letters that had been repainted twice in 7 years and were due again. He parked in the side lot, killed the engine, and sat there for a minute listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Atlas was already at the door before Ethan got his key out. Inside, the shop smelled like motor oil and the particular cold of a space that's been closed up for hours, and Ethan didn't bother with the overhead lights. He knew the floor well enough to navigate it in the dark, which he sometimes did out of habit rather than necessity. He filled Atlas's water bowl, hung his jacket on the hook by the back door, and sat down in the old office chair behind the parts counter and looked at the ceiling for a while. He wasn't tired. That was the thing about nights like this. The body ran on something other than calories and rest during them, and when they were over, the engine didn't just switch off. It idled, sometimes for hours. He thought about Olivia's face when she came off that porch. He thought about the canvas bag that was smaller than it should have been. He thought about, get some sleep, which was possibly the least adequate response to what she'd sent him, and also probably exactly right. He didn't sleep until almost 5, and when he did, it was in the office chair with Atlas across his feet, and it wasn't restful so much as it was the body finally overruling the brain on a procedural matter. Thursday came in gray and cold. The 2 vehicles he'd expected arrived within 20 minutes of each other. A 2009 Silverado with a transmission that had been complaining for 6 months, and a Subaru Forester with a brake issue the owner had been describing incorrectly for 3 weeks, which was normal. Ethan worked. That was what Thursday was, and he let it be what it was. The clean predictability of mechanical problems, which had causes and solutions and didn't flinch when you touched them. At 11:15 his phone rang. Torres. He wiped his hands on a shop rag and picked up. Caldwell. It's Torres. You have a minute? He leaned against the Silverado's front quarter panel. Go ahead. Hale came down from the mountain this morning, 6 a.m., drove himself to a lawyer's office in Billings. A pause. He filed a report alleging that Olivia left the property under duress, that she was coerced by an unknown individual, you, and that she's being held against her will at an undisclosed location. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He filed a report. He did. Against me. Against an unknown individual matching your description who he says intimidated him on his own property and facilitated his partner's removal without consent. Ethan felt the particular quality of tiredness that comes not from lack of sleep, but from recognizing a move you should have anticipated. He had anticipated it. He told Torres that Victor thought he had moves. He just hadn't expected the clock to run this fast. What does that mean for Olivia? Right now, nothing legally. She's an adult who left voluntarily with law enforcement present and documented. His report is logged, but it doesn't change her status. Torres paused. It does mean his attorney is going to come at her hard if this goes to any kind of proceeding. They'll try to establish that she was unstable, that the decision to leave wasn't competent, that outside parties, specifically you, manipulated the situation. Will it work? Depends on how strong her statement is, and whether we can corroborate the pattern. Another pause. Reed's been working the background. The 2 military investigations, he found one of the women. A woman named Sandra Keel lives in Spokane now. She's willing to talk. Ethan straightened up slightly. That's significant. It could be. If the DA decides there's enough to pursue a coercive control charge rather than just a protection order. Torres's voice shifted slightly. The off-record register again. I'm going to be honest with you. The DA is cautious. He's up for re-election. Cases like this, without physical evidence, without a documented assault, they make him nervous. What does Olivia want to do? She wants to push it. He hadn't expected anything different, but it still landed with a particular weight. The woman who had said, "I'm fine" 7 times on a farmhouse porch in the rain had decided in less than 12 hours that she was done saying it. Then she's going to need support, Ethan said. Not from me specifically, from people who know how to navigate this. I've connected her with an advocate from the Benton County DV Services Office. They're good. They've worked coercive control cases before. Torres paused. She asked about you. What did she ask? Whether you were going to be around. Ethan looked at the Silverado's engine bay. A straightforward transmission job. A problem with a solution. He was good at those. Tell her I'm around, he said. Quote, the next 10 days were not clean. They were not the movie version of what happens after a woman leaves. No montage of recovery, no visible turning point where the hard thing becomes the manageable thing. What they were was slow and bureaucratic and emotionally grinding in the specific way that legal processes are when they're working as intended, which is to say, not fast enough, not certain enough, and requiring the person most affected to redescribe the worst period of her life to a rotating sequence of professionals who needed it in different formats. Olivia gave a formal statement to the DA's office on Friday. It lasted 4 hours. She came out looking like she'd run a race that had no finish line, and she sat in Clara's car in the parking structure for 20 minutes before she could drive. Victor's attorney, a man named Garfield Pruitt, out of Billings, who had a reputation for making coercive control cases evaporate through procedural attrition, filed a motion challenging the welfare check on grounds that it had been initiated by a non-family member with no documented connection to the household. The motion went nowhere, but it took 4 days and generated paperwork. Ethan found out about Sandra Keel on the 6th day from Torres, who called with the specific tone of someone delivering news they'd earned by doing unglamorous work for a week. Sandra Keel was 41. She had lived with Victor Hale for 14 months, 8 years ago, when he was still in the Marines and stationed in Pendleton. She had not filed a report at the time. She had not spoken to law enforcement. She had moved to Spokane 6 months after the relationship ended and had spent the intervening years living a life that was entirely her own, and had, she told the investigator Reed sent to meet her, thought about Victor Hale approximately every day for 8 years, the way you think about something that left a mark you can't explain to people who weren't there. She had said yes before Reed finished asking. When Ethan heard this, he was in the shop, under the Forester, and he lay there for a moment with the car above him and the creeper beneath him, and he felt something he didn't have a clean word for. Not relief exactly, not satisfaction, something quieter than both of those, something that had to do with the specific comfort of knowing that the thing you suspected was true, is true, and that knowing it means something to someone who needed it to mean something. He slid out from under the car. Good, he said to the empty shop. Atlas lifted his head from the dog bed in the corner. Not you, Ethan said. I mean, yes, you too, generally. The dog put his head back down. But on the 9th day, Ethan drove to Clara's house. It wasn't a plan so much as a decision that arrived already made, the way some decisions do. He had a reason. Torres had asked him to come by and sign an amended statement that incorporated some additional details she needed for the DA's file. But that wasn't the whole reason, and he was honest enough with himself not to pretend it was. Clara's house was a small Victorian on the east side of town, the kind that had been built to last and had, its white paint a little worn at the porch trim, its garden gone to late fall brown but still showing the architecture of something that would be worth the effort come spring. There was a light on inside that made the front window glow amber in the gray afternoon, and there were 2 cars in the driveway, Clara's sedan and a newer compact he didn't recognize. He knocked. Clara opened the door in approximately 4 seconds, which suggested she'd seen him pull up. You didn't have to drive all the way, she said, which was technically true and practically irrelevant. Torres needed the signature, he said. Clara looked at him with the expression of a woman who has been reading people for 78 years and has long since stopped pretending she can't. She stepped back and held the door. The house smelled like coffee and something baking. Not performatively, not the house showing trick of cookies in the oven, just actual food being made by someone who cooked because they cooked. It was warm. The kind of warm that means the heat has been on for hours. Olivia was at the kitchen table. She had a laptop open, papers spread around it, a mug on a coaster that had been there long enough to leave a ring. She was wearing her own clothes, jeans, a navy sweater, and her hair was down, and she looked up when Ethan came into the kitchen doorway, and there was a brief moment of mutual reading, the kind that happens between people who have been through something together that they haven't fully accounted for yet. "Hey," she said. "Hey." He sat down at the table because Clara was already putting a mug in front of the chair across from Olivia, and arguing with Clara about whether you wanted coffee was an exercise in losing. "What are you working on?" he asked. Olivia glanced at the papers. DA's office wants a timeline. Every incident I can document, with as close to exact dates as I can get. She paused. "It's a lot of incidents." "Take your time with it." "Pruitt's attorney filed another motion this morning," she said. "Something about procedural grounds on the welfare check. Torres mentioned. It won't hold." Olivia looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because Reed documented everything correctly, and the welfare check was initiated by a family member via a third party, which is standard." He picked up the mug. "Pruitt's running the clock. He wants you to get tired." "I know what he's doing," Olivia said, and there was an edge in it. Not at Ethan, just in general. The edge of someone who has spent 2 years being managed by someone very good at it, and has developed in the aftermath an acute sensitivity to the technique. Victor used to do the same thing, make everything take longer than it needed to. More steps, more explanations, more... She stopped. "Sorry." "Don't apologize." She looked at the papers. "It's a reflex." "I know." Clara set a plate down between them without commentary, sliced bread, sharp cheddar, something with apple in it, and went back to the counter as though she hadn't done anything, which was the way Clara did most things. They sat with the coffee for a minute. Outside, the gray afternoon had decided to add a thin rain to its general program, and it tapped against the kitchen window with the unfocused persistence of weather that isn't going anywhere in particular. "Torres told me about Sandra Keel," Olivia said. "She tell you what Sandra said?" "Enough." Olivia turned the mug in her hands. "I've been thinking about her. Someone I've never met. Who went through something. Something like what I went through, or different in the specifics, but the same in the thing underneath. And she's in Spokane right now doing whatever her Thursday looks like, and she said yes to talking to investigators." A pause. "That means something to me." "She's brave," Ethan said. "She's been living with it for 8 years," Olivia said. "All that time." And she said yes immediately. She shook her head slightly, not in disbelief, but in the specific recognition of something you couldn't have understood before and understand now. "I keep thinking about the version of me that might have said no. That would have been easier in the moment and cost everything later." "You didn't say no." "I almost didn't say yes either. I almost stayed in that farmhouse because it was the landscape I knew, and the outside felt like, I don't have the right word. Not dangerous, just unreadable." She looked at him directly. "And then you knocked on the door." Ethan didn't say anything. "I want to ask you something," Olivia said, "and I want you to just answer it, not the version of the answer that's polite. All right? Did you know I was going to come out when you knocked? Did you think I'd actually leave?" He thought about it honestly. "No." She nodded slowly, like that was the answer that made sense. "I knocked anyway," he said. "Why?" He set the mug down. "Because not knocking was the only thing I was certain was wrong." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Clara was doing something at the counter that involved very little actual noise, which meant she was listening. Olivia looked at the papers on the table. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the timeline, and Ethan drank his coffee, and they sat in the ordinary warmth of Clara's kitchen while the rain tapped the window, and there was nothing remarkable about any of it except that 3 weeks ago it would have been impossible. Torres arrived 40 minutes later with the amended statement, which Ethan signed at the kitchen table with a pen that needed shaking to start, and which Clara immediately offered to replace from a drawer that apparently contained 17 functional pens organized by color, because that was the kind of woman Clara Bennett was. Torres sat down with coffee she clearly needed and walked them both through where the case stood. The DA had reviewed the initial documentation and Sandra Keel's preliminary statement and had indicated, cautiously, with caveats, with the particular careful language of a man protecting his options, that he was considering whether to pursue a coercive control charge alongside the protection order filing. It wasn't a commitment. It was the beginning of a commitment, which, in legal terms, was its own kind of progress. Victor's attorney had requested a meeting with the DA's office for the following Monday. Pruitt's going to try to present Hale as the cooperative party, Torres said. He'll bring documentation, financial support, medical appointments he took her to, anything that reads as care rather than control. He's been building that case for a while, I think. They all do that, Olivia said. And there was no bitterness in it, just the flat recognition of someone who has done research she didn't want to have to do. Victor kept records of everything he did for me. I thought it was sweet at first, that he paid attention to details. Later, I understood that the records were for him, not for me. Torres looked at her. You said that in your statement. I said it better in my statement. I've had time to practice. Your statement is very strong, Torres said. It wasn't flattery. She said it the way she said most things, like a fact. Olivia accepted it with a small nod. Is it enough? Torres was quiet for half a beat. It's enough to move forward. Whether it's enough to get a conviction on the coercive control charge, that I genuinely can't promise you. I want to be honest about that. I know. Olivia's jaw tightened slightly, then released. I'm not doing this because I'm sure I'll win. I'm doing it because not doing it is the only thing I'm certain is wrong. She said it without looking at Ethan, and she probably didn't realize she was using his words, and he didn't point it out. He just noticed it and filed it somewhere. 3 weeks after that, on a Tuesday morning in November, when the first real snow of the season was coming down over Silver Creek and Harlan and all the mountains between them in long, slow curtains, Ethan got a call from a number he recognized. Torres. Hale accepted a plea. He set down the wrench he was holding. What terms? 18 months probation, mandatory participation in a behavioral intervention program, a 5-year protection order covering Olivia Bennett and Clara Bennett. A pause. And a civil coercive control finding on his record. Permanent. It wasn't a prison sentence. He'd be lying if he said that didn't register. It's not nothing, Torres said, as if reading the silence. No, he agreed. It's not. The DA wanted a guarantee. The guarantee was the plea. If it went to trial, Pruitt would have made it ugly for Olivia for 6 to 8 weeks, and the outcome wasn't certain. Torres paused. Olivia agreed to it. It was her call. How is she? She cried for about 10 minutes and then asked what she needed to sign. A beat. Torres seemed to search for the right word and then decide the accurate one would do. She's building herself back. It's slow, but she's doing it. Ethan stood in the shop with snow falling past the window in the small rectangle of outside that the dirty glass allowed him, and he thought about what 18 months probation meant, and what a permanent civil finding meant, and what a 5-year protection order meant, and he thought about Sandra Keel in Spokane, whose name was now part of a legal record, and he thought about Torres, who had driven up a mountain in the rain because a mechanic she'd never met had called in a welfare check and given her the right information in the right order. Tell her it counts, he said. She knows, Torres said. She wanted me to tell you. He heard Torres exhale on the other end of the line. Not dramatically, just a person releasing the weight of 3 weeks of a case that had required her to hold more than her professional capacity usually required. You ever get tired of it? He asked. The cases like this. Every single one, she said. And then the next one comes in. Yeah, he said. Same. She hung up. Ethan stood there for another moment. Then he picked up the wrench and went back to work. Clara came to the shop on the first Saturday in December. She came alone, which surprised him, and she came with a container of something wrapped in foil, which did not. She stood in the shop doorway in her good wool coat, a different one than that night, this one dark blue and dry, and looked around at the place with the frank curiosity of someone who has never been in a mechanic's shop and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. "It's smaller than I pictured," she said. "It's enough space," he said. "That seems to be your standard." He set down his tools and took the foil container. It was still warm. "You drove 2 hours." "Hour 45, she said. "The roads are clear." He gestured at the office chair, the only seating in the shop that wasn't a stool or a bucket. She looked at it, looked at him, and sat down with the decisiveness of a woman who has never in her life fussed about where she sat. Atlas came over and put his head in her lap immediately, because he had made his assessment of Clara Bennett 3 weeks ago and had not revised it. "Olivia starts her new job Monday," Clara said, one hand moving through the dog's fur without seeming to notice she was doing it. "Accounting firm in Missoula. She used to do bookkeeping before Victor. She's good with numbers." "That's good," Ethan said. "She found an apartment. Small. It's near a park." Clara paused. "She called me every day this week, not because she needed anything, just to call." He opened the foil container. Some kind of bread, dense and dark, with dried fruit in it. He broke off a piece because it was clearly the right thing to do. "She's going to be all right," he said. "I know," Clara said. "I've always known that. She's stronger than she looks." "She's always been stronger than she looked. That's partly why he chose her, I think. Men like that. They don't choose weak people. They choose people with something inside them that they want to own." She said it with the clarity of someone who has had weeks to think it through and has arrived at something that is painful and precise and accurate. And Ethan looked at her and thought about what 78 years of paying attention to the world costs a person and what it gives them in return. "I wanted to ask you something," Clara said. "All right." "The night at the café, you could have called the police yourself and gone back to your coffee. You had enough information to pass it along." "I could have," he said, "but you drove up that mountain." "Yes." "Why?" He chewed the bread. It was very good. He thought about the question the way he'd thought about Olivia asking why he knocked. Not looking for a satisfying answer, just an honest one. "I've passed things along before," he said. "Done the right thing at the minimum required level. Made the call and trusted the process and gone home." He paused. "Sometimes the process works fine. Sometimes there's a gap between what you report and what actually gets done, and someone falls through that gap." He looked at the snow falling past the shop window. "I decided a long time ago that I'm not willing to be the gap." Clara was quiet for a moment. "You lost people," she said. It wasn't a question. He looked at her. She was watching him with the particular attention she gave things, direct and without pretense. "Some," he said. "To the gap." "To the gap." He picked up another piece of bread. "You learn to hate the gap." Clara nodded slowly. Then she looked down at Atlas, who had not moved from his position with his head in her lap, and she scratched behind his ear with the focused affection of someone who knows how to give comfort without making a performance of it. "Olivia asked me to give you something," she said. She reached into her coat pocket and produced a small envelope. Not fancy, just an envelope, the kind you buy in a multi-pack. His name on the front in handwriting that was careful without being precious. He took it. "She said you don't have to read it now," Clara added. He opened it now. The note inside was 3 sentences. He read them, and then he folded the paper carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, and Clara watched him do it without asking what it said. What it said was, "You told me this wasn't the end of anything, that it was just the first night. You were right. I wanted you to know the nights have been getting better." He sat with that for a moment. Then he looked at Clara. "How are you?" She blinked. The question had clearly surprised her, which told him that people didn't ask it enough. "Me? You walked into a cafe in a rainstorm asking strangers for directions to a police station," he said. "That's not nothing." Clara looked at her hands for a moment. "I was terrified," she said, and it was the first time he'd heard her describe it in the past tense. "The whole drive down the mountain. I didn't know if I was doing the right thing. I didn't know if I was making it worse. I'm 78 years old, and I was sitting in my car outside that cafe telling myself—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. telling myself that I'd lived through enough hard things to walk into one more room and ask for help. And then you walked in. And then I walked in. She looked at him. And you were sitting in the corner. I was going to leave, he said. My coffee was cold. I was done. Claire's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but something in that direction, the kind that comes with recognizing how thin a margin separates what happened from what almost happened. What made you stay? She asked. Loretta's doesn't have a drive-through, he said. I had to walk past the counter to pay. Clara made a sound that was unambiguously a laugh, short and genuine, surprised out of her. And it changed the quality of the air in the shop in a way that Ethan hadn't expected and found he was glad of. Don't tell Olivia that, Clara said. I won't, he said. Let her have the version where it was deliberate. After Clara left, with the empty foil container and Atlas's nose print on her coat sleeve and the slightly different expression of someone who came in carrying something and is leaving with less of it, Ethan locked the shop and sat in the office chair in the quiet. The snow was coming down steadily now. Not a storm, just accumulation. The kind that covers things slowly and changes the character of familiar spaces by making them white and muffled and new-looking in the morning. He thought about the 3 sentences in his shirt pocket. He thought about Victor Hale somewhere tonight, on probation, in whatever space a man like that occupies when the room has finally and definitively stopped going his way. He didn't waste energy hoping for things he couldn't verify. What he knew was the protection order, the civil finding, the permanent record. What he knew was Sandra Keel, who had driven to a meeting with a county investigator and told the truth for 2 hours and gone home to her Thursday in Spokane. What he knew was Torres, who got up tomorrow and went back to work. What he knew was Olivia, who was going to start a job on Monday near an apartment near a park, and who called her grandmother every day now just to call. He didn't think of himself as a hero. He was genuinely uncomfortable with the word, in the way people are when a label fits the outline of something but not the thing itself. What he'd done: drive up a mountain, stand in a driveway, make a phone call, buy coffee for a woman who needed her hands warmed, wasn't heroism. It was just refusal. Refusal to look at the right door and walk past it. Refusal to be the gap. He'd spent 7 years after the army trying to be ordinary. The shop, the town, the routine, Atlas. The careful smallness of a life built by a man who'd seen what happened when things got large and fast and loud, and had decided to build in the opposite direction. He didn't regret it. It was a good life. It had what it needed to have. But sitting here in the shop with the snow coming down and a 3-sentence note in his pocket, he understood something he'd been orbiting around for a few weeks without landing on directly. You could be ordinary and still be the person in the room who notices. Those weren't in conflict. They'd never been in conflict. He'd just convinced himself they were, the way tired people sometimes build walls between 2 things that were never actually separate. Atlas came to sit beside the chair. He was 11 years old, and his muzzle was almost entirely gray now, and his hips were starting to give him trouble on cold mornings, and he sat beside Ethan the way he always had. Not performing loyalty, just being present in the way that dogs are present when they have decided, somewhere below the level of language, that here's where they're supposed to be. Ethan put his hand on the dog's back. "Good boy," he said, which was true and insufficient, and the only language available for what he meant. But the months that followed were not dramatic. That was the part that never made it into any version of the story that got told, how undramatic the aftermath was, how it happened in grocery store trips and phone calls and Saturday mornings and slow accumulations of ordinary time. Olivia went to work on Monday and came home on Monday and called Clara at 7 p.m., and the same thing happened Tuesday and Wednesday, and the pattern of it was its own kind of medicine, the repetition that tells you it's real and not borrowed. She went back to therapy. She'd gone before, briefly, early in the relationship with Victor, and had stopped because he'd found gentle ways to make it inconvenient, scheduling conflicts that always somehow landed on therapy days, mild disappointment when she came home from sessions, a subtle but persistent suggestion that she was better now and probably didn't need it. Wasn't she better now? She went back, and she stayed. And some weeks it helped, and some weeks it felt like describing a fire to someone who'd never been warm. But she went. She got her phone back, not the one Victor had cracked, a new one, with her own account and her own password and her own lock screen, which was a photo of Clara's garden from last spring that she'd taken herself. She drove again. It took 3 weeks of short trips before she could take the highway without her hands going tight on the wheel, and 2 months before she stopped scanning the road behind her at every interchange. But she drove. In February, she went to Spokane. She and Sandra Keel met at a coffee shop not far from Sandra's apartment, and they sat for 3 hours, and what they talked about was private and stayed that way. What Ethan learned of it, he learned from Clara, who learned it from Olivia in fragments over several weeks. They talked about the way it starts, the way you don't see the edges closing in because the edges move slowly and you're always being told that your perception is the problem. The way the person you were before becomes someone you can remember but not quite reach, like a word on the tip of your tongue that keeps retreating. They talked about after, how the after is also not what you expect, because you think leaving is the hard part. And then you discover that leaving is just the first hard part, and that the subsequent hard parts don't announce themselves in advance. Olivia and Sandra met twice more before spring. They didn't become close friends, exactly. They were two people bound by a specific shared thing rather than by the ordinary affinities of friendship. But they called each other occasionally, and that was its own kind of sufficient. Sandra Keel testified at a civil proceeding in March, and what she said took 40 minutes and was met with Pruitt's expected counteroffensive, and the judge listened to all of it with the expression of someone who has read every version of this particular story and is weighing this one carefully. The judge ruled in favor of the civil finding. It held. Ethan heard about it from Torres in a text message that said 3 words: finding upheld, permanent. He was under a truck when the message came in. He read it in the dim with the oil pan above his head, and he thought about those 3 words for a moment, and then he slid out from under the truck and told Atlas it was lunchtime, which was not strictly accurate, but was what the moment seemed to require. Spring came the way it always does in Montana, late and abrupt, like it had been arguing with itself about whether to bother, and then all at once everything went green so fast you could almost watch it happen. The mountains lost their snow at the peaks slowly, holding it in the high places where the sun didn't reach until June, and the valley towns warmed up, and the mud dried, and the air had that particular quality. It gets when winter's been long and everyone has forgotten what it smells like to have windows open. Ethan opened the shop doors on the first truly warm morning and let the air come through, and Atlas lay in the threshold with his eyes half closed and his face in the sun, and Ethan drank his coffee and watched the street and felt, without needing to name it, that the thing that needed doing had been done. Not perfectly. It was never perfect. The system that had told Clara there was nothing to be done until there was evidence of a crime was still the same system. The gap between what the law recognized and what people actually lived through was still real and still swallowed people. Victor Hale was on probation and would be off it in 18 months and would do whatever he did next with whatever he was, and Ethan had no power over that. But Olivia was in Missoula, and Sandra's testimony was in a permanent record. And Torres was going back to work tomorrow, and Reed was writing things down correctly, and Clara was in her house with her garden coming back to life in the April thaw. It was enough. Not everything. Not clean. Not finished in the way that things are finished in stories where the ending is the ending, but enough to build on, which is all anything ever is. On a Saturday in late April, a car Ethan didn't recognize pulled up to the shop. Olivia got out. She was alone. She was wearing a light jacket and her hair was shorter than it had been in the fall, cut to the jaw, and she moved across the parking lot with a quality of motion that was different from the farmhouse and different from the county substation. Less contracted, less alert for the wrong things. She still noticed things. That probably wouldn't go away. But the noticing was pointed outward now rather than turned in on itself as self-protection. She stopped a few feet away and looked at the shop with the same frank curiosity her grandmother had shown in December. "You painted the sign," she said, "in March." She looked at him. "It looks good." It was overdue. A moment. Atlas had appeared in the doorway and was considering her, and she crouched down without hesitating and let him come to her, which he did, and she scratched behind both ears with her full attention, and he accepted it with the dignity of an animal who has always known his own worth. "I came to tell you something," Olivia said, not looking up from Atlas. "All right. I got a promotion at the firm, 3 months in." She looked up then. "Which I know isn't. It's not a big thing." "It's a thing," he said. "They said I have a way of finding the problem in the numbers before anyone else sees it." She paused. "I've always been able to see where things don't add up. I just spent 2 years being told my math was wrong." He nodded. She stood up, looked at him directly. "How are you?" He considered the question the way she'd asked it, without deflection, without the automatic fine that lived in the front of the mouth and cost nothing to say. "Better for knowing it worked out," he said. "It's still working out," she corrected. "Yeah," he said. "That's what I meant." She reached into her jacket pocket and produced something small, a key on a plain ring. She held it out. He looked at it. "What's that?" "Claire's spare," she said. "She said to tell you the door's always open, but she also said to stop making you rely on the concept and give you an actual key." He took it. It was a plain house key, nothing remarkable, the kind of key that gets cut for $8 at a hardware store. He turned it in his fingers once. "Tell her I said thank you." "Tell her yourself," Olivia said. "She's making that bread again on Sunday." He put the key in his pocket. She said goodbye and drove away, and he watched the car until it turned off the main street and the town absorbed it. And he stood in front of his shop with a key in his pocket, and his dog leaning against his leg, and the spring sun on the back of his neck. And he thought that this was what the aftermath of a good thing felt like. Not triumphant, not cinematic, just warm and ongoing and real. He went back inside. He picked up his tools. He went back to work. The town of Harlan moved on, the way small towns do, carrying its stories the way rivers carry silt, invisibly, distributed through the whole of the moving thing, building something somewhere downstream without any single part of the water knowing it's doing it. And the man in the corner booth, the one who noticed what other people missed, and then did something about it rather than nothing, went home on Saturday nights to a small house on the edge of town, and a dog who met him at the door, and built his ordinary life with the quiet purposefulness of someone who has learned that ordinary and meaningful are not opposites. They never were. The greatest thing you can do for another person is sometimes enormous and sometimes very small, and it almost never looks, in the moment, like the thing it actually is. It looks like getting up from a table. It looks like driving up a mountain in the rain. It looks like standing in a driveway and not moving. It looks like knocking on a door when you don't know what's on the other side. It looks like refusing to be the gap. The rest, the healing, the testimony, the key on a plain ring, the rest comes after. But it starts with someone in the room who decides to stay.